In the dank shadows of Edinburgh's Westport district, where cobblestones glistened with perpetual moisture and narrow winds twisted like hangman's ropes, death became a trade more profitable than any honest labour. The year was 1828, and in the fetid air between tenement walls, two men discovered that fresh corpses could fetch a better price than whiskey, and that the line between opportunist and murderer was as thin as a surgeon's blade. The dissection table at Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy school never went cold that winter. The bodies arrived with suspicious regularity, still warm, unmarked by the grave robber's spade, perfect for the educated hands that would peel back layers of humanity in the name of medical science. The students didn't ask questions about the freshness of their subjects. In the candlelight of the anatomy theatre, only knowledge mattered. Knowledge purchased with guinea coins that jingled in the pockets of William Burke and William Hare. Their enterprise began, as many horrors do, with happenstance. When Donald, an elderly lodger at Hare's boarding house, died owing £4 in rent, opportunity presented itself in the form of his corpse. The medical schools were desperate for cadavers, and the Anatomy Act that would legalize the supply of bodies was still 4 years away. That first sale, that first taste of easy money, would set in motion a machine of murder that would claim 16 lives and cement their names in the annals of criminal history. The psychological landscape of 1820s Edinburgh was as divided as its geography. The new town rose in Georgian splendor, while the old town festered in medieval squalor. In the shadow of this divide, Burke and Hare occupied a particular niche: Irish immigrants in a Scottish city, labourers in a place that prized education, opportunists in a society that demanded either respectability or resignation to poverty. William Burke had arrived in Edinburgh with dreams of bettering himself. A cobbler and navigator of the Union Canal by trade, he possessed a peculiar charm that would later prove useful in luring victims. His relationship with Helen MacDougall added respectability to his appearance. Contemporary accounts describe him as articulate, even genteel in his manner, a wolf in workers' clothing. William Hare remains more enigmatic. His boarding house in Tanner's Close was a place where the desperate came to die slowly of poverty or drink. He had a harder edge than Burke, a capacity for violence that showed in his eyes long before it manifested in his actions. His wife, Margaret Laird, kept the lodging house running while harbouring her own dark ambitions. Together, they created an environment where death was not just expected, but could be hastened for profit. The methodology they developed was frighteningly efficient. They would identify vulnerable targets, travellers, prostitutes, the elderly, the ill, and ply them with whiskey until insensibility set in. Then came what would later be known as Burking. One man would sit on the victim's chest while the other pinched their nose and mouth shut. It left no marks, no evidence of violence. To the anatomists, these deaths appeared natural. Their victims form a litany of the forgotten: Janet Brown, an aging prostitute; James Wilson, a mentally disabled young man known as Daft Jamie; Mary Patterson, a beautiful young woman whose death would later haunt the conscience of Dr. Knox's students. Each life was worth between £8 and £10, a fortune to men who had known only poverty. The psychological deterioration of the murderers followed different paths. Burke, by all accounts, drank heavily as the murders continued, perhaps trying to drown the faces that haunted his dreams. Hare remained cold, calculating, focused on the business aspects of their enterprise. Their wives and paramours, Margaret Laird and Helen MacDougall, became accomplices, setting the stage for their men's dark work with whiskey and false friendship. The anatomy schools, particularly Dr. Knox's establishment, operated in a moral twilight zone. The demand for bodies was insatiable. Medical science was advancing rapidly, and students needed practical experience. The law restricted legal dissection to the bodies of executed criminals, creating a market that grave robbers and eventually murderers were happy to supply. Dr. Knox himself remains a controversial figure in the narrative. Did he suspect the source of these suspiciously fresh corpses? His students later recalled their unease at the condition of the bodies they dissected, but Knox maintained his ignorance. The relationship between medical progress and moral compromise became a central question in the subsequent scandal. The murders might have continued indefinitely if not for the discovery of Mary Doherty's body on Halloween 1828. Burke and Hare had grown careless, leaving the corpse under a bed where lodgers discovered it. The House of Cards collapsed quickly after that, with Hare turning King's evidence against Burke in exchange for immunity. The trial that followed became a sensation. Burke alone stood in the dock, Hare having purchased his freedom with his testimony. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Burke's confession, made after his conviction, revealed the full scope of their crimes and introduced the verb to burke into the English language, meaning to smother or quietly suppress. The psychological impact on Edinburgh society was profound. The cases exposed the dark underbelly of medical progress and the vulnerability of the poor in an increasingly urban, industrialized world. The respectable citizens of the new town had to confront the fact that their medical education was built on murder, while the residents of the old town faced the reality that predators walked among them. Burke's execution on January 28, 1829, drew a crowd of 25,000. In a final irony that would have pleased Dr. Knox, Burke's body was publicly dissected at the Edinburgh Medical College. His skeleton remains on display at the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, a grim reminder of how science and murder once walked hand in hand. The aftermath saw significant changes in British law. The Anatomy Act of 1832 finally provided a legal framework for medical schools to obtain cadavers, though the poor remained its primary subjects. The act was both a response to the Burke and Hare murders and an acknowledgement that medical science needed to find ethical ways to advance. William Hare disappeared into history after his release, though rumors of his fate persisted for decades. Some said he was blinded by an angry mob in London, others that he died in a lime pit in Ireland. The uncertainty of his end seems fitting for a man who made death his business. Dr. Knox's career never recovered from the scandal, though he was never legally implicated. He left Edinburgh for London, where he continued to teach anatomy, but never regained his former prominence. His fall from grace represented the medical establishment's reluctant acknowledgement of its own moral compromises. The impact on medical ethics was lasting. The Burke and Hare murders forced the medical profession to confront questions about the source of their anatomical subjects and the moral cost of progress. The scandal contributed to the development of ethical guidelines that would eventually govern medical research and education. Today, in the University of Edinburgh's Anatomical Museum, Burke's skeleton stands as both exhibit and warning. His bones, arranged in anatomical correctness, serve the purpose he once murdered to supply. His confession, preserved in archives, reads like a business ledger of death, dates, names, prices paid. The final entry remains unfinished, like a lesson interrupted. And somewhere in the old stones of Edinburgh, in the closes where mist still clings like grave cloth to the walls, there are those who swear they hear footsteps on certain dark nights, the sound of two men walking, stopping, waiting, their pockets heavy with coins, forever searching for one more body to sell.